A lot of towns in the American West have statues or plaques or murals or something similar to the statue that you can see behind me. It depicts a group of settlers arriving in this location with idyllic, hopeful looks on their faces, about to claim this land for European settler colonialists who arrived here in the 1800s. It's a form of propaganda that's everywhere around us all the time, and we hardly ever notice it. Here's a term you need to have in your pocket: Settler-Colonialism. Settler-Colonialism is a form of colonial formation whereby foreign people move into a region. An imperial power oversees the immigration of these settlers, militarily supporting them against indigenous people in the region. The reason you need to have this term at your fingertips is because it sounds like an anachronism. It sounds like an overly pedantic way of describing something that happened a long time ago in some other place. But if you live in the majority of the world that was colonized sometime in the last half of the previous millennium by European powers, then settler-colonialism is happening around you constantly. It's the water you swim in. You just are so accustomed to it that you don't see it. To show you what I mean by this, I'm going to talk about the place that I live, Portland, Oregon. Let's go back to that statue I showed you. It depicts a white settler family arriving in the Willamette Valley. The man points at their new home. The woman inclines her head gratefully. Behind them are the symbols of their role as settlers: a wagon wheel because they came from far away, and a rifle because they're taking this land by force if necessary. In the child's hands is a Bible because American settler colonialism was heavily steeped in Christian ideology. Settlers saw themselves as new Israelites settling a new promised land. Absent from this image are any indigenous people. Their absence is intentional. We're meant to have the impression that these settlers arrived here innocently in empty lands, virgin territory. Our attention is purposely fixed upon the act of settlement apart from the act of conquest in order to cast it in the most noble light possible. The conquest is merely suggested by the rifle casually leaning on the wheel behind them. At the base of this statue is a quote from Thomas Jefferson. "It is so long since our forefathers came from beyond the great water that we have lost the memory of it and seem to have grown out of this land as you have done. We are all now of one family, born in the same land and bound to live as brothers. The Great Spirit has given you strength and has given us strength, not that we might hurt one another, but to do each other all the good in our power." This quote doesn't actually mention indigenous people either, carefully trimmed as it is to omit the context. It comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a chief of the Osage people in 1804. It was part of a policy that Jefferson was employing of trying to entreat with every single indigenous group that he could find in order to cut them off from their relationships with England, France, and Spain so that America could solidify its hold over the continent. The rest of the letter basically says, "Hey, buddy, old pal, we're friends, right? Don't make any deals with those guys over there. In fact, you can't make any deals with them over there because my military is gonna stop you." By which I mean, forget I even mentioned them. I'm the only one you need to worry about. I'm your friend, and see how similar we really are. This wasn't just a ploy that Jefferson was using to get indigenous peoples to break off connection with other nations so that America could get control over the continent. This was also part of a plan to make it so that indigenous people would adopt European agricultural practices, which Jefferson hoped would civilize them so that they could be assimilated into mainstream American society. Or at the very least, he would indebt them by forcing them to pay for the implements necessary to do this agriculture so that they would then be forced to sell off their land to him, and he could move them onto reservations. In other words, the quote on this statue was a colonial ploy in its original context, and here, divorced from its history, it's even more misleading. It's intended to imply a harmony that never existed. The entire city of Portland is designed this way, to present a romantic view of settlers while completely erasing the indigenous history of this place. You're gonna make a guest appearance in today's video.
No, am I really?
Yeah, we're at this, PDX Sliders. All of the burgers are named after neighborhoods in Portland. All the places in Portland. We're gonna eat them. They're all excellent, especially the Burlington. It's great. Just look at the way things are named. Most of the neighborhoods, major streets, and landmarks in Portland are named after the group of settlers that arrived here in the 1850s following the Donation Land Claim Act. This is no accident. The land here, as elsewhere in the United States, was distributed in sweeping chunks of 320-acre plots for free, exclusively to white people. This massive land and resource redistribution set up the inequality that has persisted in our society. White European settlers became suddenly very wealthy, while indigenous people were moved to reservations, often on the least productive and valuable sections of their former land. And of course, non-white immigrants, slaves, and freedmen were excluded from this wealth redistribution project. Maybe it's just me, but I always sort of had this impression that most things were named in grandiose fashion after the really important historical events, heroic or virtuous people, or stories and symbols with deep mythic resonance. But if you look at it, all of these places and names are really just some guys and their buddies who happen to have a bunch of stuff given to them for free. The narcissism of the colonial project is really astounding. When they weren't busy naming things the equivalent of me calling the place I live Eric's Town, they were just naming stuff after their favorite pop culture references. No joke, there are places in Portland named Kenilworth, Waverly, Woodstock, and Ivanhoe, which are all names taken from novels by Sir Walter Scott that were popular at the time. It'd be like me naming a town Twilight and the streets Bella Street, Jacob Avenue, and Edward Place. If that doesn't impress upon you how cavalier they were with these names, consider that the Columbia River was just named after the boat of the first European guy who sailed up it. He was like, "What should I call this river? Heck with it, let's just call it whatever is written on the side of this boat." I mean, the city of Portland itself got its name by two dudes arguing over which of them got to name it after their hometown back east. One of them was from Boston, and the other one was from Portland, Maine. They couldn't agree, so they literally flipped a coin. The winner of 2 out of 3 tosses got to name the city. That's how much thought they put into this. The effect of all of this casual naming of everything by settlers is that we erase the indigenous people and their history from the land, thus facilitating their ongoing removal and extermination. And simultaneously, we cut ourselves, the settlers, off from ever becoming rooted in this place. Instead of experiencing ourselves as guests in this land and investing the time and energy necessary to learn the history and lore and ecology of our new home, we just papered over everything with whatever sounded vaguely reminiscent of the places we had come from. We have streets named Madison, Harrison, and even Montgomery, that guy who caught a bullet in the neck in Quebec. In summary, what do they have to do with the Pacific Northwest? And sometimes, the names we give things don't just erase indigenous people, they're direct insults. I'm standing in front of the Native American Student and Community Center of Portland State University, which sits on 710 Southwest Jackson Street. Yes, that Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, the Indian killer, the man responsible for the Trail of Tears. Not only that, running just behind the center are the streets named Sherman and Sheridan, both named after generals who participated in the Indian Wars, committed terrible atrocities against Native Americans, and whose lasting legacy includes quotes like these. Remember that Bible in the statue's hand? The religious symbolism of settler colonialism isn't innocuous at all. This is Mount Tabor, a hill in the neighborhood of the same name in southeast Portland. In 1853, there were some Methodists that settled in this region, and they didn't know the indigenous names for this area. Reverend Clinton Kelly's son, Plimpton, suggested Mount Tabor, which is a mountain in Galilee, which appears in scripture. Particularly, it's famous for a battle in the book of Judges between the people of Israel and the Canaanites of the time. Now, the Canaanites in scripture are the indigenous people settled in the land of Canaan, or Palestine, or what would later be known as Israel. And it was them who the people of Israel had to cleanse from the land in order to lay claim to this promised land of theirs. Manifest Destiny and settler colonialism in the United States used a lot of biblical imagery and concepts. They deeply believed that this new territory, this new land that they were discovering, was the promised land for them of sorts. And on top of Mount Tabor, of course, another statue of a white man. Settler colonialism is all around us. It has irrevocably shaped our world in countless ways, and it's ongoing. But we act, for the most part, as if it was distant history. So long as we allow these things to remain subconscious, we will continue to replicate the patterns of settler colonialism. The names of streets and neighborhoods, the statues and plaques in our cities, and the narrative they tell about heroic settlers arriving in an empty land and generous builders creating a society out of nothing, is a political narrative. To wake up to it, to begin seeing it, is the first step in decolonizing ourselves and our society.